The cabin of the private jet hummed with the low, soothing sound of engines cutting through the thin, high-altitude air. The dim lights cast soft shadows across the plush leather seats, giving the atmosphere a sense of tranquility. Yet beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. What would you do if the world's most powerful man, unfazed by criticism, controversy, and all the trappings of his fame, was insulted by a flight attendant? This question swirled through the minds of the other passengers as they adjusted their seatbelts and settled in for the long flight ahead. At first glance, this jet, a sleek, state-of-the-art aircraft designed for those who didn't just fly, but ruled the skies, was just another routine experience for those aboard. But there was one person on board whose presence turned the ordinary into something extraordinary. His name? Elon Musk. The man who had redefined innovation, disrupted entire industries, and sparked countless debates with his tweets. He was used to the attention. In fact, he thrived on it. Yet, in this confined space, under the watchful eyes of an attentive flight crew, something happened that no one, least of all Musk, could have anticipated. The flight attendant, Rachel, had always prided herself on her professionalism, her impeccable service, and her unwavering ability to keep her emotions in check. She had served some of the world's wealthiest, most influential figures, but today, something about Elon Musk stirred an uncharacteristic fire within her. Perhaps it was the way he arrogantly dismissed the flight safety demonstration, or how he condescended to the crew, tossing out one-liners laced with arrogance, like he was the star of his own reality show. Maybe it was the underlying sense of entitlement that came with being one of the most recognizable figures on the planet. Whatever it was, Rachel's patience wore thin. "Excuse me, Mr. Musk," she said, her tone calm but firm as she approached his seat. "Could you please pay attention to the safety instructions? This is standard procedure." Elon looked up, his eyes glinting with the mischievousness that had earned him both admiration and disdain. A slight smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Oh, I'm sure I'll be fine," he said, as if the rules didn't apply to him. Rachel took a breath, her gaze narrowing slightly. "I'm sure you will," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "But not everyone in this world is a billionaire, and some of us still have to follow the rules." The words hung in the air for a moment, heavy with tension. The passengers, all uncomfortably aware of the exchange, held their breath. Could it be? Was the flight attendant, this seemingly ordinary woman, really challenging one of the most influential men in the world? Elon Musk paused, his eyes narrowing as he processed her words. Then, as if struck by a sudden inspiration, he leaned back in his seat, a gleam in his eye. This wasn't just a disagreement. This was an opportunity. The other passengers waited, wondering what the world's richest man would do next. Would he laugh it off? Or would he, for once, do something none of them had ever seen before? The moment Rachel spoke those words to Elon Musk, the atmosphere in the jet shifted, like a sudden crack in an otherwise serene mirror. The passengers' eyes darted between Elon and the flight attendant, as if waiting for the storm to break. Elon didn't flinch, but his expression morphed from casual amusement to something more calculating, a flicker of recognition that he was no longer the unquestioned authority in the room. Rachel felt a rush of heat rise to her cheeks. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was more like a jolt of adrenaline, a sense of having crossed an invisible line into dangerous territory. She'd always been good at keeping her composure, even when dealing with the most entitled, self-important celebrities or tycoons. But there was something about Musk's cocky air, his utter lack of regard for the people around him, that had broken her calm exterior. She glanced briefly at the other flight attendants, who had gathered near the galley, pretending to busy themselves with preparations for the in-flight meal. There was no support there, just the dull, resigned air of professionals who had seen it all before and knew better than to stir the pot. Rachel had always prided herself on her reputation. She wasn't the kind of person who picked fights. But today, today was different. "Mr. Musk," she said, her voice steady but laced with the unmistakable sting of challenge. "I'm not asking you to agree with me, but when I'm doing my job, I expect a little respect." Her words hung in the air, louder now than they had any right to be. The silence in the cabin deepened. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging glances like they were watching a slow-motion train wreck. No one had ever dared to talk to Musk this way, not in public at least. Rachel could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders, threatening to crush her beneath its intensity. Elon's eyes were locked on hers now, but his face remained unreadable. For a moment, he didn't say anything. His gaze lingered just long enough to make Rachel's heart skip a beat. She wasn't sure what he was thinking, but she could feel the gears turning behind his piercing stare. Then, almost imperceptibly, his lips curled into a half-smile, a knowing, almost amused look that made Rachel's stomach tighten with unease. "You're right," he said, leaning forward in his seat, his voice smooth and measured. "I could have been a bit more courteous, but you should know that I don't like being told what to do, especially by people who think they know better than me. Maybe you should learn to pick your battles." His words were soft, but there was an unmistakable edge to them. A warning, wrapped in a compliment. Rachel's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her breath shallow with the sting of his dismissiveness. She had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. The passengers were watching her, waiting to see what she would do next. Would she back down, or would she stand her ground? Before she could respond, the captain's voice crackled through the intercom, breaking the tension. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've just reached cruising altitude. Please relax and enjoy your flight." But for Rachel, the flight had already turned into something far more complicated than it should have been. The small, quiet act of standing up for herself had unraveled a thread, and she could already feel it pulling her into something much bigger. And the consequences? Well, those were only beginning to reveal themselves. Rachel's heart raced as she walked briskly to the back of the plane, trying to gather her thoughts. She didn't regret speaking her mind. But in the back of her mind, she couldn't help but wonder what this confrontation with Musk would cost her. Back in the first-class cabin, a few of the passengers whispered among themselves. One of them, a young tech entrepreneur named Claire, had watched the entire exchange unfold. She leaned forward, eager to catch Rachel's eye. "You know," Claire said quietly, "I've seen a lot of people go toe-to-toe with Musk, but you really did it." Rachel gave her a tight smile, but the unease still simmered beneath the surface. "I had to. Someone had to." She wasn't sure if she was trying to convince Claire or herself, but as the plane continued its journey across the sky, one thing was certain. This wasn't just a fleeting moment of rebellion. This was the catalyst for something that would spiral out of control, challenging everything Rachel thought she knew about herself and her place in the world. And she had no idea what Musk's next move would be or what it would mean for everyone on board. Rachel couldn't shake the sense of unease that lingered in the air after her confrontation with Musk. The quiet hum of the jet's engines seemed to mock her as she moved through the cabin, avoiding the curious stares of the passengers. She tried to focus on her duties, going through the motions as she served drinks and refilled trays. But every time she glanced at Elon, his smug expression seemed to pierce right through her. The man hadn't even bothered to apologize, let alone acknowledge her attempt at professionalism. In the galley, Rachel found a moment to breathe, leaning against the cool metal counter. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured herself a glass of water, staring blankly at the plane's flight map on the screen. She was here, stuck in the air, far above the ground with no easy escape. Her heart still pounded from the sharp words she'd exchanged with Musk. Was it really worth it? She wasn't sure anymore. It wasn't just about the fight. It was what came after. The awkward silence, the judgment in the eyes of the other passengers, and the ever-looming threat of repercussions. Claire's Earlier words echoed in her mind. You really did it. But what did that even mean? Did she really do something significant? Or had she just provoked a man who held too much power for it to matter? Rachel leaned forward, rubbing her temples as she tried to suppress the growing wave of self-doubt. In her gut, she knew the stakes had shifted. She had made an enemy, but that enemy was no ordinary person. Elon Musk had the ability to bury anyone who crossed him under a mountain of public ridicule or legal retaliation. The weight of that realization hit Rachel hard. She thought back to her years of experience in the airline industry, the countless times she'd been forced to bite her tongue when dealing with insufferable passengers. She'd weathered it all, pompous billionaires, entitled politicians, even the occasional celebrity tantrum. But Musk was different. He didn't just live in a world of luxury and privilege, he controlled it. People made entire careers out of being in his orbit, and here she was, a mere flight attendant, challenging him over something as trivial as a safety briefing. What had she been thinking? A sharp voice interrupted her self-reflection. Rachel? It was her manager, Mark. He stood in the doorway, his face a mixture of concern and apprehension. We need to talk. His words were calm, but the tension in his posture was palpable. Rachel straightened up, immediately sensing that something had shifted. She nodded slowly, stepping out into the narrow corridor with him. The last thing she needed was to escalate things further with management. But she couldn't avoid it. She had already made her stand. Look, Mark began, lowering his voice. I know this might be difficult to hear, but the higher-ups are already getting wind of what happened back there with Musk. People are talking. Rachel's stomach dropped. What do you mean, talking? Mark hesitated, as if weighing how much he should reveal. The CEO's office, the clients in the front cabin. They're all aware, Rachel. Some of them are even saying you could be in trouble. Rachel's face paled. Trouble? For what? I did my job. He's the one who... I know, Mark interrupted, rubbing the back of his neck. But that's not how this works. Musk's people are already reaching out to corporate. They want a word with you. A cold chill ran down Rachel's spine. Her instinct was to push back, to defend her actions, but the weight of the situation was dawning on her. This wasn't just about her pride or a moment of defiance anymore. It was about her career. If Musk wanted her gone, she could be out of a job faster than the jet could land. The walls of the cabin felt suddenly smaller, suffocating her. For the first time since the altercation, Rachel wasn't sure where she stood. Her shoulders slumped slightly, the adrenaline that had once fueled her fiery resolve starting to ebb away into doubt. Could she really stand up to this kind of power? What had she even accomplished? Rachel, Mark said gently, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Maybe it's time to consider toning it down a little for the rest of the flight. The suggestion stung more than Rachel cared to admit. She didn't want to shrink. She didn't want to bow down. But the consequences of defying Elon Musk were real and severe. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing against her chest. As Rachel walked back to her post, the sound of Mark's words lingered in her mind. She wasn't sure if she had the strength to back down, but she was beginning to understand the true cost of the fight she had started. The turbulence hit suddenly, the plane shaking violently as though echoing the storm inside Rachel's chest. She gripped the armrest of the nearest seat, trying to steady herself, though the unease was more internal than external. The reality of her situation, the growing tension between her and Musk, the looming threat of losing her job, the whispered conversations in the galley, had sunk in deeper than she cared to admit. Her instincts screamed at her to retreat, to play it safe and smooth over the mess she had made. Maybe she could just apologize and let it blow over. But then something unexpected happened. Rachel was walking past the first-class cabin when she heard a voice, a familiar voice, call out her name. Rachel, over here! She turned to see Claire. the young tech entrepreneur who had watched the earlier confrontation unfold. Claire's eyes were wide with excitement, and as Rachel stepped closer, Claire lowered her voice, glancing nervously around the cabin. "You need to see this," she whispered, handing her phone over. Rachel hesitated, confused, but then her curiosity got the better of her. She glanced at the screen and saw what looked like a video clip. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized what she was looking at. A video of her and Musk from earlier, captured by one of the other passengers. In the footage, Rachel could be seen challenging Musk over the safety demonstration, her calm yet firm words clearly audible. The video had a raw authenticity, and while it captured the tension, it didn't paint Rachel as the villain at all. In fact, if anything, it made her look heroic. Claire, sensing Rachel's hesitation, leaned in. "It's already going viral. A lot of people are picking up on it. People who actually respect what you did. They're calling you a boss for..." Standing up to him. Rachel blinked, struggling to process the whirlwind of emotions flooding her. Her first instinct was to panic, to wonder if this was somehow going to backfire. But as she scrolled through the responses, something unexpected began to dawn on her. People were rallying behind her. Hundreds of likes, supportive comments, and hashtags like "Your Musk meets," "His match," and "Respect for Rachel" began to flood in. She felt a strange mix of disbelief and exhilaration. Her confrontation, the one that had felt like an impulsive mistake, was suddenly being viewed through a completely different lens. She wasn't the one out of place. It was Musk who had been caught in a rare moment of vulnerability. The powerful billionaire had been publicly checked by a flight attendant, and the world seemed to find it poetic. But just as Rachel's thoughts were beginning to shift, a new notification popped up on Claire's phone, an official statement from Musk's company. Her heart skipped a beat as she read the headline. "Elon Musk responds to flight attendant's challenge. A new kind of leadership?" The text below was unexpected even by Musk's standards. Rather than dismissing the incident or attacking Rachel, the statement was cryptic, almost provocative. While safety measures are paramount, true leadership is about challenging norms. Perhaps the world needs more voices like Rachel's, bold, unafraid to speak truth to power. Rachel felt a chill run down her spine as the gravity of what she had just read sank in. It wasn't a rebuke. It was an invitation. She didn't know what to think, or even what to feel. Had Musk somehow changed his tune? Or was this a calculated move on his part? Some sort of subtle manipulation? Was he using her for his own gain? But then the deeper realization hit her. She wasn't powerless anymore. The weight of it all settled in. The tension, the public scrutiny, and now this strange twist. Musk wasn't coming after her. Instead, he seemed to be validating what she'd done, albeit in his own enigmatic way. Rachel's mind raced, her heart pounding as the emotional stakes suddenly skyrocketed. She wasn't just a flight attendant anymore. She was part of a larger narrative now, one that could propel her into uncharted territory. The moment she had feared, the fight she'd thought might cost her everything, had just opened an entirely new door. But which direction would she go? She had no idea what Musk's next move would be, or how this bizarre exchange would play out, but one thing was certain. The trajectory of her life had shifted irreversibly, and it was only just beginning. The cabin was suffocatingly quiet. Rachel stood at the front of the jet, hands clasped in front of her as the weight of the situation settled on her like a heavy cloak. Musk was seated just a few rows away, his eyes locked on her as if waiting for something. His team had arrived a few minutes ago, slipping in unnoticed like shadows, but their presence hung over her like a storm cloud. She had thought she would be afraid, that she would crumble under the pressure of what had transpired, the viral video, the public scrutiny, the storm of controversy. But the more she stood there, the more she realized she wasn't afraid anymore. The flight attendants had already scattered to their respective posts, avoiding her gaze, each one silently bracing for the fallout. But Rachel's mind was focused. only on one thing: this moment. The opportunity in front of her was far bigger than any of them had anticipated, bigger than the airplane, bigger than the jet. This was her chance to define herself, to decide what kind of person she was going, to be what kind of legacy she would leave in the wake of all this. She turned slowly, meeting Musk's gaze. His expression was unreadable, that signature air of superiority still firmly in place. But something was different now. There was a flicker of something else. A challenge? Curiosity? Rachel's breath hitched as she stepped toward him. She wasn't just walking toward him physically. She was walking toward something that had been growing inside of her for years, something that had been buried beneath her desire for approval, for safety, for quiet compliance. She stopped right in front of him, close enough to feel the hum of his presence, yet distant enough that the distance between them felt like an ocean. "Mr. Musk," Rachel said, her voice surprisingly steady, "I didn't do this for you. Or for anyone else. I did it because someone needed to say it. You can't keep dismissing the world around you like it doesn't matter. People matter. We matter." The words were out before she could stop them. The truth that had been festering inside of her for so long had spilled out. She had been holding back for years, suppressing the urge to stand up, to speak out, to demand the respect she deserved. But that moment on this jet had pushed her over the edge. Elon's eyes flickered for just a second, a spark of something akin to surprise flashing behind them. It wasn't often that someone spoke to him with such honesty. People were intimidated by him, even afraid of him. But Rachel wasn't. "What do you think I should do about it, Rachel?" Elon asked, his tone measured, as though he was toying with her, testing the waters. Her heart skipped a beat. This was the moment she had feared would come. A test. A challenge. Musk was asking for an answer, not a compromise. He wasn't going to back down, and neither could she. "I think you should start by listening, really listening to the people who aren't afraid to speak the truth. You don't have all the answers, and you don't know everything, and neither do I. But I do know that I'm not going to be silenced just because it's easier for you that way." The words came fast now, an emotional floodgate bursting open. The crowd of passengers had gone silent, watching the drama unfold with rapt attention. No one dared to move or breathe too loudly as they witnessed this incredible standoff. Elon's lips twitched into a smile, this time a genuine one, not the playful arrogance that usually marked his demeanor. There was respect in his eyes now, a recognition of something in Rachel that no one had expected. "You've got guts," he said quietly, his voice carrying an edge of admiration. Rachel's breath came out in a sharp exhale. For a moment she thought the weight of it all would crush her. Her own voice, her own defiance, the emotions that swirled within her. But she stood there, unyielding. This was the turning point. No longer a flight attendant, no longer just another cog in a world that chewed up and spit out people like her. Today, she had become something more, something real. There was a pause, a heavy silence in the air, and for the first time, Rachel realized that the power dynamics had shifted. Musk, the man who had always been in control, wasn't in control anymore. This was her moment, her time to stand tall. Finally, Elon leaned back in his seat, nodding slowly. "You're right. Maybe it's time for something new." As Rachel walked away, a deep sense of peace washed over her. She didn't know what the future held, whether this would result in a job loss, a viral sensation, or something else entirely, but for the first time, she didn't feel afraid. She felt alive, and with that, the game had changed. The jet eventually landed, the roar of the engines quieting as it touched down on the tarmac. For most of the passengers, it was a return to the ordinary, the end of their journey. But for Rachel, it felt like the beginning of something entirely new. Her heart still pounded in her chest, but now it was the feeling of triumph, not fear. She made her way through the airport with the same measured steps, but her mind was racing. The world felt different now. Lighter, freer, as though she had broken free from something she hadn't fully realized had been holding her captive. The confrontation with Musk had been more than just a moment of rebellion. It had been a revelation. She hadn't been trying to prove a point to him or to anyone else. She had been proving something to herself. Rachel's phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. She pulled it out and saw dozens of notifications flashing across the screen. Messages from friends, family, and colleagues. The video had gone viral, the reactions pouring in from all corners of the internet. But what caught her attention the most was a message from Mark, her manager. "Rachel, you're not going to believe this. The higher-ups are very pleased with how you handled everything. Elon Musk's team reached out and said they'd like to speak with you directly. They're looking at you for a potential partnership in one of their upcoming projects." Rachel blinked, reading the message again. The words felt surreal. Elon Musk's team? A partnership? She couldn't help but laugh, short, sharp, almost, incredulously. How could this be happening? What had started as a simple confrontation over safety protocols had snowballed into something far beyond anything she'd imagined. The whole world had watched her stand up for herself, and now it seemed that Elon Musk himself had taken notice. Still, Rachel wasn't naive. She knew that this could be a tactic, some kind of strategic play to either own the narrative or make her an ally. Musk was a master at control, after all. But even that didn't matter. What mattered was that, for the first time in her life, she was no longer on the sidelines. She was in the game, and whatever came next, she was ready to face it head-on. As she stepped out of the airport, the early evening sun casting long shadows on the pavement, Rachel took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill her lungs. She had been afraid of what would happen if she stood up for herself. But now, with the weight of it all behind her, she understood. The fear had been the prison, and breaking free from it had been the only way to truly live. For a brief moment, she wondered what Musk would do next. Would he offer her a seat at his table? Or would this entire episode be forgotten, a fleeting moment in time? But Rachel knew, deep down, that it didn't matter. She had already won. The world had seen her strength, her courage, her truth. And no matter what came next, it was hers to carry forward. "You don't have to be a billionaire to change the world," she thought to herself, with a small, satisfied smile. "Sometimes all it takes is one voice." And with that, Rachel stepped into her future, unapologetically herself.